So picture this. You are standing at the very top of Signal Hill.
Oh, gorgeous spot.
Right. And you're looking down, and spread out below you are these steep, cobblestone streets of Bo-kaap. And the houses lining those streets, they aren't just your standard boring city blocks. They are painted in these incredibly vibrant, like unapologetic candy
Yeah,
colors.
you got the burnt orange, the bright turquoise,
Exactly. Deep fuchsia, lemon yellow, just all stacked together right there on the hillside.
and it creates this really striking visual contrast, against the gray granite of the mountain right behind it.
It really does. But it's not just a visual experience. If you stand there long enough, just sort of drifting up from the kitchens below, you can actually smell toasted masala and like sweet cinnamon catching the breeze.
Oh, wow. That sounds incredible.
And then echoing off that massive rock face of Table Mountain, you hear the adhan, the Islamic call to prayer. And that specific sound has echoed across that exact landscape through all kinds of historical weather for over 200 years.
Which is just a staggering legacy when you really sit and consider the political and social turbulence of South Africa over the last 2 centuries.
Yeah, and that resilience is exactly where we're starting today. Welcome to our deep dive. We are looking at a community that is, frankly, a genuine anomaly in the global Islamic world. We're talking about the majority Muslims of South Africa.
Right, because despite their size and this incredibly deep-rooted history you just described, they are largely invisible on the global stage.
Yeah, they don't fit the neat demographic boxes that people usually, associate with the Islamic world, which is what makes their history so incredibly rich.
Absolutely.
So today, our mission is to explore what is basically a masterclass in survival and identity. We are going to look at what happens when an organic, really hard-won tolerance collides head-on with imported, divisive ideologies.
It's such a compelling clash.
It is, and we're using this excerpted narrative by Ferry de Bruyne's called The Quiet Crescent, Faith, Survival, and the Soul of Cape Town's Muslims, to kind of guide us through this. Okay, let's unpack this. Where exactly did this isolated community even come from?
Well, their foundation was built in some of the most brutal chapters of colonial history, honestly. To understand the Cape Muslims, you really have to look at the Dutch East India Company back in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Because they weren't just trading spices.
Well, not at all. They were moving human beings.
Yeah.
This community descends from slaves, political exiles, and convicts that were brought to the Cape from incredibly disparate regions. I mean, we're talking about people forced onto ships from Southeast Asia, Madagascar, the Indian subcontinent, and the East African coast.
Wow. So you just have this incredibly diverse group of people, entirely different cultures and languages, suddenly forced into the exact same hostile, completely unfamiliar environment right at the bottom of Africa.
Exactly. And out of that shared trauma, a completely new culture began to forge itself. Over generations, these exile populations intermarried.
Right.
They intermarried with the indigenous Khoisan people of the Cape and eventually with European settlers as well. So because of this blending, you end up with a community that defies simple categorization.
You have this whole spectrum of physical features.
Yeah, skin tones ranging from pale olive to deep brown, and a brand new mixture of languages and inherited histories.
There's a historical detail here that, it absolutely stopped me in my tracks when I read it, and it has to do with how they were named.
Oh, the surnames. Yes.
Yeah, when you look at the prominent surnames in the Cape Muslim community today, you see names like Abrahams, Davids, Jacobs, Hendricks.
Right, names that sound distinctly European or biblical.
Exactly. And to an outsider, it might just look like, oh, they assimilated. But the reality is just this tragic irony. Those names were forced onto them by Dutch record keepers and slave owners.
It was essentially an administrative tool of erasure.
Tell me a little bit more about how that worked, like why those specific names?
Well, when enslaved people or political exiles arrived at the Cape, the Dutch East India Company officials often couldn't or, simply wouldn't pronounce their original names.
Right, of course.
So to establish dominance and really strip away their ties to their homelands, the Dutch gave them new names based on the calendar month they arrived.
Wow.
Or they just assigned them common biblical or Dutch names. So centuries later, their ancestors' enslavement is literally written into the legal surnames they carry today.
It's just a systemic attempt to wipe the slate of their identity completely clean. And yet, look at the sheer endurance of this group. I mean, they survived the daily brutalities of slavery under the Dutch. They survived the subsequent British colonial wars that swept through the Cape.
Yeah.
And then in the 20th century, they survived the systemic oppression of the apartheid regime,
Yeah.
a government that, deployed actual bulldozers to crush their neighborhoods and scatter their families.
They faced centuries of institutional attempts to erase them, and they simply refused to disappear.
Thinking about this incredibly harsh timeline, it honestly reminds me of the process of grafting plants. Have you ever seen an arborist do that?
Where they bind the tissue of one plant to the stem of another?
Yeah, exactly. You take all these completely different fragile plant species, different leaves, different roots, and you physically bind them together. Now imagine planting that newly grafted sapling in incredibly toxic, unforgiving soil.
Right.
By all traditional logic, it should just wither and die. But instead, it adapts. It pulls whatever trace nutrients it can find, and it grows into this completely new, utterly unbreakable tree that literally couldn't have grown anywhere else on Earth. That is what the Cape Muslim history feels like.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that analogy of adapting in harsh soil is just the perfect lens for understanding their civic institutions. Because this community had to build its infrastructure entirely from scratch, in total isolation. They did not have the safety net of state aid. There were no grand imperial endowments from Middle Eastern monarchs, and there were certainly no foreign petrodollars flowing in to help them build.
So they were entirely self-reliant.
100%. Everything was crowd-funded by pennies from the working class. They erected their own mosques, they built madaris, which are, religious schools, and they established their own primary schools and orphanages.
Wow.
And I think the most remarkable part of this self-taught survival is how outward-facing it was. Their charities didn't just look after their own, they fed the hungry across the Cape, whether those hungry families were Muslim, Christian, or Hindu. Their communal grit and their togetherness was literally their only shield in a world that was entirely designed to break them.
So we have this massive, sweeping, historical macro view of how the community formed. But what makes this deep dive so compelling is how the text lets us zoom way in. We can look at this macro history through the micro experience of one specific person.
Right, a man named Joseph.
Yeah. Joseph's personal trajectory really serves as this emotional core for understanding how the Cape Muslims operate on a human level.
It really grounds all that history.
It does. So Joseph starts out as a working-class Christian guy from the Cape Flats. He grows up going to Sunday school, he sings the hymns, he knows all the theology. But as he matures, he hits this philosophical wall that he can't climb over. He struggles deeply with the concept of the Trinity.
And it's important to note here, this isn't framed as some sort of adolescent rebellion.
No, not at all.
It's a profound crisis of logic and conscience for him.
Right. He's trying to reconcile how the infinite, the ultimate creator of the universe, could somehow fit inside a finite, mortal creation. He is just craving an absolute, indivisible unity of God. And how he eventually finds that unity is so telling about the culture of the Cape.
Because he doesn't get converted by some slick, wealthy missionary passing out glossy pamphlets on a street corner.
Exactly. There was no aggressive proselytizing. None at all. He discovers Islam simply by existing alongside his Cape Muslim neighbors. He's working in the factories, and the Muslim guys next to him just, share their lunch.
Yeah.
They quietly fast during Ramadan, they pray in the dusty back rooms on their breaks, and they give to charity. They are just living their faith out loud without ever once telling Joseph he needs to change his.
And that quiet consistency is what ultimately draws him in.
It does. And it leads to Joseph taking the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, and he becomes Yusuf. His everyday world undergoes this beautiful, deeply sensory shift.
The physical changes in his life are so striking.
Yeah, the Christmas tree gets packed away into storage, and the search for the new crescent moon of Ramadan takes its place. The dinner table is cleared of wine and pork and replaced by strictly halal meat.
It's just a complete rewiring of his daily rhythms.
He learns to say Bismillah, invoking the name of God before he takes a bite of food, and Alhamdulillah, giving thanks when he finishes. He even marries a Cape Muslim woman, Amina. And he does this specifically to protect any future children from the theological tug-of-war that caused him so much internal grief.
He wants his kids to have a clear, unified foundation.
Right. He is attempting to build the sanctuary of clarity for his family. But this is where I need to pause and ask you to clarify something.
Sure.
Yusuf converts because he is seeking the pure, uncomplicated unity of one God. But once he steps out of his local Cape Town neighborhood and tries to engage with the wider global Muslim world, unity is not exactly what he finds, is it?
No. He finds the exact opposite. What's fascinating here is how Yusuf's internal peace is met with just a massive headspin. He steps into what the text perfectly describes as a sprawling bazaar of opinions.
A sprawling bazaar. That paints such a chaotic picture.
It really does. Because suddenly Yusuf is confronted with all these highly opinionated, globally imported factions. And to understand the chaos, we need to quickly look at where these factions come from.
Okay.
First, he encounters the Shafi'i school of thought, which emphasizes a certain legal rigidity and was historically brought over by exiles and traders from Indonesia and Malaysia. Then he bumps into the Hanafi school, which leans more heavily on rationalism and originated from the Indian subcontinent.
And they're both operating the exact same small geographic space.
Yes, along with several others. He meets followers of the Tablighi Jamaat, a movement that travels constantly to encourage grassroots prayer, but often brings a very rigid cultural conservatism from South Asia along with it.
Oh, wow.
And then, probably most disruptively, he crosses paths with the strict Puritans of the Wahhabi or Salafi tradition. And they were quick to denounce anything they deemed a modern innovation as bid'ah, or religious heresy.
So Yusuf realizes that a practice considered totally acceptable, even beautiful, in one corner of his new faith is aggressively condemned in another. They're arguing over the exact placement of hands during prayer, the required length of a beard, or whether it's heresy to celebrate the Prophet's birthday.
Right. And for centuries, the Cape Muslims had successfully sidestepped all of this sectarian friction entirely. If you ask them what they were, they didn't identify as Sunni or Shafi'i or Hanafi. They just called themselves Kaapenaars, people of the Cape, or simply Muslims.
Just keeping it simple.
Exactly. In a diverse, often hostile society, just being Muslim was enough of a marker. They didn't need the microscopic subdivisions.
But that quiet, insular peace gets shattered. Which brings us to a phase we can call the imperial incursion. And before we get into the mechanics of this, I really want to frame the historical context for you, the listener.
That's important, yeah.
So the narrative we are following details the arrival of foreign organizers and missionaries in the late 20th century. These groups arrived eager to mobilize the Cape Muslims for various distant geopolitical conflicts, specifically focusing on Palestine, Kashmir, Iraq, and Syria. Now, our goal today isn't to take a political stance on those global conflicts.
Right, absolutely not.
We are not endorsing any viewpoints here. We're simply analyzing impartially how the arrival of these external pressures and ideologies impacted the specific local community on the ground, according to the text.
It's a crucial distinction. We are purely looking at the sociological impact of imported ideology on an indigenous culture.
Exactly. So these foreign missionaries arrive in Cape Town. They are coming from regions that once held the massive Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires. And when they look at the Cape Muslims, they don't see resilient survivors. They look at them with barely concealed contempt.
That contempt was rooted in a very imperial mindset, and it manifested in several disdain culture clashes. The text outlines 6 points of contempt, basically.
Let's go through them.
First and foremost was the issue of race. The outsiders viewed the Cape Muslims as racially impure, precisely because of that beautiful survival-driven intermarriage with Khoisan and European populations we discussed earlier.
Wow, that's incredibly harsh.
It gets worse. They also judged their language. The missionaries came from places where Arabic or Persian were the elevated languages of faith. They arrive in the Cape and hear locals speaking English, Afrikaans, and a unique Cape Dutch dialect infused with Malay. To the foreigners, this didn't look like adaptation. It looked like cultural backwardness.
Just a total lack of understanding of what they went through to survive.
Completely. Third, they saw a glaring lack of imperial history. The Cape Muslims didn't have a lineage of kings or caliphs or any ambition to conquer and rule. Their entire history was focused on just keeping their children fed and their faith alive under oppressive governments.
Which the outsiders somehow interpreted as spiritual mediocrity.
Yes. Fourth, they even criticized the architecture. The local mosques in the Cape were modest. They were often just repurposed warehouses or simple buildings without the massive domes or soaring minarets you'd see in Istanbul or Delhi.
So they were judging them for not having massive wealth.
The missionaries were looking for physical monuments of power, and all they found were quiet spaces of survival. Fifth, they were appalled by the Cape Muslims' total ignorance of foreign fatwas, religious rulings, and distant philosophers. The Cape history was written in the dust of their own streets, not in Eastern palaces.
But the final clash of worldview, the sixth point, is what I think is the most tragic. It was their tolerance. The Cape Muslims had survived by living alongside non-Muslims. They shared neighborhoods, they married across racial lines, they exchanged food and celebrated with their Christian and Hindu neighbors.
And to the puritanical missionaries, this organic, completely necessary tolerance wasn't a beautiful social achievement. It was viewed as a dangerous dilution of faith.
Reading how this unfolded, it is exactly like watching aggressive corporate raiders taking over a beloved, highly successful, multi-generational mom-and-pop shop.
That is such a good way to put it.
Right. These raiders walk into the store, look around, and tell the locals their entire business model is garbage, simply because they don't have a shiny glass skyscraper and a board of directors wearing tailored suits.
That is an incredibly apt comparison. Because these foreign organizers didn't just stand on the sidelines and critique, they actively executed a cultural hostile takeover. They systematically identified and grabbed the community's brightest youth and most eloquent local leaders
Wait, how did they pull them away?
by offering them prestige. They handed out foreign scholarships, invited them to overseas conferences, and offered them a connection to this larger, supposedly more authentic and powerful Islamic world. It was a massive brain drain.
And it almost tore the local community apart. I mean, the sheer brutality of apartheid couldn't break the Cape Muslims. But this imported sectarian division, this obsession with who was practicing the purest version of the faith, nearly fragmented them completely.
Which brings us to the emotional climax of our narrative. Because this grand, sweeping theological war wasn't ultimately fought in the mosques or at academic conferences. The true battlefield was a family kitchen.
The kitchen battlefield. I have to say, the scene is so vivid it feels cinematic. We're back with Yusuf the convert and his wife Amina, and their 12-year-old daughter Zainab comes home from her local madrasa. Now, usually she comes through the door singing, just full of life. But today, she drops her bag. Her pink headscarf is pulled askew, and she is just fighting back tears.
The author uses sensory details here to brilliantly ground the heavy theology in domestic warmth.
It's such a contrast.
It is. You have Yusuf standing at the counter chopping fresh coriander. Amina is at the stove stirring a bridi, which is this very traditional slow-cooked Cape stew made of lamb and tomatoes, heavily spiced with cinnamon, cardamom, and ginger. And resting on a cooling rack are Koi sisters, these deeply sweet, syrupy, spiced local donuts.
It is the absolute picture of Cape Muslim comfort and safety. And right into this warm, fragrant room, 12-year-old Zainab drops this heartbreaking question. She looks up and asks, "Baba, are we real Muslims?"
A question that brings all that external chaos right into their home.
Yeah. She explains that her teacher, a man named Ustad Abdul, publicly shamed her in front of the entire class. Why? Because she didn't know her madhab. She couldn't name the specific historical legal school of thought she supposedly belonged to.
Over labels, basically.
Exactly, and to make it worse, during the humiliation, a classmate called her a coconut, meaning brown on the outside, white on the inside, simply because her father, Yusuf, is a mulaf, a convert.
It's the cruelty of children, entirely fueled by the imported ideological obsession of the adults teaching them.
And I just have to push back hard on this Ustad's teaching style. Reading this, it feels like this teacher has completely confused memorizing the technical rulebook with actually knowing how to play the game.
Oh, absolutely.
How on earth do you explain centuries of lived, bloody, hard-won survival to a 12-year-old who is suddenly being bullied by a sterile textbook?
This raises an important question, and it is the absolute core of Yusuf's response to his daughter. Yusuf understands something the Ustad doesn't. He makes a profound distinction between possessing the knowledge of rulings and possessing the wisdom of survival.
Wait, unpack that difference for me. Knowledge of rulings versus wisdom of survival. I mean, it sounds incredibly poetic, but what does that actually look like in practice for Yusuf's daughter?
Think of it this way. Knowledge of rulings is knowing the exact chemical composition of a brick and arguing over the precise angle it should be laid. It's theoretical and rigid. Wisdom of survival is knowing how to take whatever broken stones you have and actually build a shelter that keeps your family alive during a hurricane.
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
The Ustad has the theoretical knowledge, but the Cape Muslims have the shelter.
Right. And Yusuf physically grounds this lesson. He literally kneels down on the linoleum floor, so he's eye level with Zainab. He reminds her of his very first Ramadan. He tells her how lonely it was. He didn't know any Arabic. He didn't know the proper historical names for the rituals. But he tells her he knew in his bones that knowing God was enough.
And then Amina, the mother, steps in. She delivers this fierce, beautiful defense of their specific heritage. She tells her daughter, We are all these foreign labels they want to put on us. We are Kaapenaars.
She gives Zainab her history back. Amina reminds her that their ancestors built the first mosque on Dorp Street in direct defiance of the authorities, that they prayed in cramped attics, hiding from the police during the Group Areas Act, that their true history isn't in some textbook from the Middle East, it is buried in the community maqbaras, their local graveyards.
And Yusuf drives the point home. He tells Zainab that her teacher might have a head full of imported knowledge about ancient disagreements and technical rulings, but that teacher doesn't know what it actually means to hold on to your faith when your language is forbidden by the state and your culture is being actively erased.
And then Yusuf gives her the ultimate armor for the next time the Ustad questions her legitimacy. This is the absolute climax of the narrative. He tells Zainab to look her teacher in the eye and say that her Islam is as wide as the ocean at Muizenberg and as deep as Table Mountain's roots.
It is a stunning, undeniable assertion of local, lived identity over imported theoretical ideology.
It honestly gives me chills, and that powerful moment brings us to the end of the narrative, leaving us with this quiet image of Yusuf sitting alone on his stoop, his front porch at night in Bo-kaap. He's looking out over the cobblestone streets.
Streets that, crucially, survived. The historical context here is vital. While the vibrant, diverse neighborhood of District 6 was entirely bulldozed into dust by the apartheid government, Bo-kaap remained. It still stands today as a living monument of resistance.
And as Yusuf sits there, he thinks about those foreign scholars, academics from France and the US, who occasionally visit and praise his community's remarkable tolerance. And he realizes they kind of missed the entire point.
Yeah, they really do.
Their tolerance wasn't some progressive, liberal political stance designed to be applauded at a modern academic conference. It was a gritty, pure survival instinct. If they didn't tolerate each other, if they didn't share their bread across religious lines, they would have been swallowed whole by the hostile world surrounding them.
They did not need external validation from foreign scholars or puritanical missionaries to know who they were. Their togetherness, their reliance on each other was the only thing that kept them alive.
So, what does this incredibly rich history mean for you, listening right now? The story of the Cape Muslims serves as a massive testament to the enduring value of authentic, lived experience. They survived slavery, and they survived the brutality of apartheid because they relied on their own hard-won communal wisdom.
Yeah.
They didn't survive by strictly following imported, rigid rules from people who fundamentally did not understand their daily reality.
It is a powerful reminder that sometimes the strongest, most resilient structures in our lives are the ones we build ourselves from the ground up, using the actual soil we live in, rather than importing a blueprint from somewhere else.
Which leaves me with a final provocative thought I want to throw your way, something for you to really chew on after this is over.
Okay.
If the desperate need for external validation, like chasing foreign prestige, accepting outside funding, and obsessing over ancient labels, almost destroyed a local community that had literally survived the crushing weight of slavery and apartheid, in what areas of our own lives are we doing the exact same thing?
It's a question that challenges our daily motivations, for sure.
Think about it. In our careers, in our personal beliefs, in the way we run our own communities, where are we trading our hard-won, authentic, local wisdom for the shiny, divisive approval of outside experts?
We so often undervalue the messy, beautiful things we have built organically just because they don't look official or prestigious on paper.
We really do. So the next time you catch yourself seeking that outside validation, maybe take a pause. Picture those unapologetic, candy-colored houses standing defiant on the steep slopes of Signal Hill. Remember the scent of cinnamon catching the breeze, and remember the sound of a faith that never needed anyone's permission to echo off the granite face of the mountain.